In 1600, Britain was a damp, quarreling little island that most of Europe barely noticed. By 1920, it ruled a quarter of the entire planet and controlled the fate of nearly 500 million people who had never even seen its shores. It did this not with the largest army in the world, but with a company, a navy, and an unshakable belief that the rules simply did not apply to them. But here is what almost nobody tells you. The empire that took 3 centuries to build was gone in barely 50 years. 2 world wars, 1 bankrupt treasury, and a single humiliating retreat from a canal in Egypt was all it took to unravel everything. This is the story of how Britain stole a quarter of the world, and how it lost it faster than almost anyone expected. Before the story of empire begins, England was a minor, damp kingdom overshadowed by wealthier European rivals. Spain shipped silver from Peru and Mexico, filling its treasury with more wealth than any nation had seen. Portugal controlled the spice routes to India, growing rich on pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg alone. England, by comparison, exported wool and little else, watching richer neighbors carve up the known world. English sailors, unable to compete honestly, turned instead to piracy against Spanish treasure fleets. Queen Elizabeth secretly funded privateers like Francis Drake, who plundered Spanish ships for profit and glory. In 1588, Spain sent its mighty armada to invade England and end the piracy once and for all. Storms and nimble English ships scattered the armada, humiliating Spain on the open sea. That victory built no empire, but it shattered the myth that Spain's navy could never be beaten. Merchants across London began to ask why Spain and Portugal alone should profit from distant trade. In December of the year 1600, a group of these merchants secured a royal charter from the crown. They named themselves the East India Company, chasing pepper and spices across dangerous, unfamiliar oceans. Almost nobody involved imagined that this modest trading venture would one day govern an entire subcontinent. At the very same time, other English ships crossed the Atlantic chasing land instead of spices. Long before any ocean voyage, England had already practiced colonization closer to home, in neighboring Ireland. Tudor armies and settlers seized Irish land throughout the 1500s, a rehearsal for empires still to come. In 1607, settlers founded Jamestown in Virginia, the first lasting English colony in North America. Jamestown nearly collapsed within its first years, ravaged by starvation, disease, and conflict with the Powhatan people. Tobacco eventually saved the colony, giving investors back in London a reason to keep sending ships. Within decades, similar colonies rose in Massachusetts, Barbados, and scattered islands across the Caribbean Sea. Meanwhile, back in London, joint stock companies became the preferred vehicle for funding risky overseas ventures. Investors bought shares, spreading risk across many pockets rather than gambling entire fortunes on a single voyage. None of these outposts looked anything like an empire yet, just fragile ventures run by private companies. But a distinct pattern had already begun to form across every one of these early ventures. Time and again, private merchants and companies led the way, with the crown following quietly behind them. This arrangement let England expand overseas without ever risking the full weight of its own government. It was a strange, improvised beginning for what would eventually become the largest empire in history. To understand how such a small island built a global empire, you must understand the corporate charter. A royal charter granted a private company legal monopoly over trade across an entire named region. The East India Company could raise its own soldiers, mint its own coin, and negotiate treaties abroad. It could even declare and wage war in the name of profit rather than in the name of the crown. This structure meant Britain could expand its reach without spending crown money or risking crown soldiers directly. If a company venture failed, its investors absorbed the loss, not the government or its reputation. If a venture succeeded, the crown quietly collected taxes and loyalty without lifting a single finger. Alongside these companies stood the Royal Navy, which grew steadily into the most powerful fleet on Earth. Laws called the Navigation Acts required colonial goods to travel only on British ships, guaranteeing British profit. Together, chartered companies, a dominant navy, and protective trade laws formed the empire's true engine. This corporate model effectively let Britain outsource conquest itself, disguising empire building as ordinary commerce. It explains why so much of the empire was first built by companies rather than official armies. Only later, when profits and stakes grew too large, did the British government step directly in. The first great prize of expansion was sugar, grown on Caribbean islands seized from rival European powers. Barbados, Jamaica, and the Leeward Islands turned fantastically profitable through the brutal labor of enslaved Africans. Wars fought against the Dutch during the 1650s and 1660s secured English control over key Atlantic shipping lanes. By 1670, English merchants dominated the sugar trade, and London's docks overflowed with Caribbean wealth. In India, the East India Company slowly shifted from humble trading partner to armed regional power. As the once mighty Mughal Empire weakened, local rulers competed for allies among European trading companies. Robert Clive led company soldiers against the Nawab of Bengal at the Battle of Plassey in 17. Victory at Plassey handed the company control of Bengal, among the richest provinces in the entire world. Tax revenue extracted from Bengal alone soon rivaled the total income of the British government at home. Company profits from Bengal financed further conquests deeper into central and southern India over the following decades. Rival French forces were pushed out of most of India following a string of costly, drawn-out wars. In southern India, company forces fought 4 separate wars against Tipu Sultan, the ruler of Mysore. Tipu died defending his capital of Seringapatam in 1799, and Mysore fell fully under company control. Meanwhile, in North America, British and French colonists fought bitterly over fur, land, and frontier control. This local rivalry escalated into the 7 Years' War, fought across Europe, America, Africa, and Asia at once. British forces captured the fortress city of Quebec in 1759, breaking French power across the continent. The 1763 Treaty of Paris handed Britain Canada, Florida, and vast new territory beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Captain James Cook charted the Pacific through the 1770s, mapping Australia and New Zealand for the crown. In 1788, the first fleet landed at Botany Bay, founding a penal colony that later became a continent. Settlers, convicts, and soldiers pushed steadily inland, claiming grazing land far beyond any earlier agreement. Within a century, Australia supplied Britain with wool, gold, and a steady stream of eager new settlers. In Africa, explorers, missionaries, and traders opened inland routes that companies and soldiers soon followed closely. Cecil Rhodes pushed British interests deep into southern Africa, chasing diamonds, gold, and fertile farmland. European powers met in Berlin in 1884 to divide Africa among themselves without consulting a single African ruler. Britain emerged from that conference holding Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, Kenya, and land stretching from Cairo toward the Cape. Further south, Britain fought 2 costly wars against Dutch settler republics known as the Boers over gold and land. The Second Boer War, ending in 1902, cost tens of thousands of lives on both sides of the conflict. Victory folded the Boer republics into a unified South Africa, still under overall British authority and influence. In the Middle East, Britain secured influence over Persia and the Gulf states through oil concessions and treaties. Control over the Suez Canal, purchased in shares back in 1875, secured the fastest route straight to India. Each new region brought fresh opponents, fresh resources, and fresh justification for keeping the empire growing. Yet even at its most confident, the empire suffered a wound it never fully saw coming. In 1775, 13 American colonies rebelled, furious over taxation imposed without any voice in Parliament. Colonial militias, reinforced by France and Spain, gradually wore down exhausted British forces year after year. In 1781, General Cornwallis surrendered his army at Yorktown, ending any real hope of crushing the rebellion. News of the surrender stunned London, where few had imagined losing colonies considered so essential. The 1783 Treaty of Paris formally recognized the United States, stripping Britain of its oldest, richest colonies. It marked the empire's first true defeat, proof that distant subjects would not obey the crown forever. Some in Parliament even questioned whether empire itself was worth its staggering financial and human cost. For a brief moment, Britain's imperial confidence cracked, though it would not stay cracked for long. Rather than retreat from empire altogether, Britain simply redirected its ambitions eastward and southward instead. Losing America pushed London to focus far more heavily on India, Africa, and the wider Pacific. Convicts once destined for Georgia were now shipped instead to Australia to build entirely new colonies. The East India Company expanded its private army until it numbered nearly 200,000 soldiers. That private army eventually grew larger than the standing army of the British government itself. In 1857, Indian soldiers rebelled against the company in a bloody, widespread uprising across the subcontinent. After crushing that rebellion, the British government dissolved the company and took direct control of India. India became the undisputed crown jewel of empire, ruled now by a viceroy answering straight to London. This pivot from company rule to direct government rule marked a new, more centralized phase of empire. All of these separate expansions eventually converged into one staggering historical peak by the 20th century. The First World War, despite its horrors, actually expanded British territory through League of Nations mandates. Britain gained control over Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan in the years immediately following that war. By 1922, the British Empire covered nearly 13 million square miles of the Earth's entire surface. It governed roughly 458 million people, close to a quarter of all humanity alive then. Red ink marking British territory stretched across every inhabited continent on the planet at once. No empire in recorded history, not Rome, not the Mongols, had ever controlled so much land simultaneously. London stood, for a brief golden moment, as the undisputed financial and political center of the world. Yet the very war that expanded the empire's map had already begun quietly draining its strength. The First World War killed nearly 1 million British and imperial soldiers and emptied the national treasury. Colonies that had fought loyally for Britain began demanding independence as their reward for such sacrifice. Ireland, closest of all, fought a brutal war for independence and split from Britain in 1922. Then came the Second World War, a conflict that nearly bankrupted Britain from its very first year. During the Battle of Britain in 1940, the Royal Air Force barely held off a planned German invasion. Months of relentless bombing during the Blitz flattened entire neighborhoods across London and other major British cities. Winston Churchill's government borrowed billions of dollars from the United States simply to keep fighting on. Cities across Britain lay in ruins, and rationing stretched on for years after the fighting finally ended. Rationing of food and fuel continued in Britain for nearly a decade after the war had ended. By 1945, Britain had technically won the war but stood financially exhausted and deeply indebted. The Marshall Plan from the United States helped rebuild Western Europe, but offered Britain no comparable imperial lifeline. India, the empire's richest and most populous possession, now demanded independence with a force London could not resist. In August of 1947, Britain partitioned the subcontinent, creating the independent nations of India and Pakistan. Violence during that partition killed hundreds of thousands of people as new borders tore communities apart. Losing India removed the entire strategic and financial reason many other colonies had existed in the first place. One by one, African and Asian territories began demanding the very same right to govern themselves. Ghana achieved independence in 1957, becoming the first African colony to formally break free from British rule. Nigeria, Kenya, Malaysia, and dozens of other territories followed throughout the 1950s and 1960s. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising revealed just how violently some colonies were willing to fight for freedom. In Malaya, British forces fought a long guerrilla war before granting independence there in 1957 as well. British troops withdrew from Aden in 1967, abandoning a key military base guarding the route to Asia. White settlers in Rhodesia declared independence unilaterally in 1965, delaying majority rule there until Zimbabwe emerged in 1980. Even Hong Kong, held under an old lease, was finally returned to China in 1997. Meanwhile, newly independent nations began forming their own alliances, no longer dependent on London for direction. The final humiliating blow arrived in 1956, not in London, but along the Suez Canal in Egypt. Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the canal, threatening Britain's fastest sea route to Asia. Britain and France launched a secret invasion of Egypt to seize the canal back by force. The United States, unwilling to support old-style colonialism, refused financial backing and forced a humiliating withdrawal. Suez proved definitively that Britain could no longer act as a true global power without American approval. Within a generation after that humiliation, nearly every remaining British colony gained its own independence. The empire that had taken over 3 centuries to build had unraveled in barely 50 years. By the 1960s, the sun that once never set on the empire was setting almost everywhere at once. Today, the physical empire is almost entirely gone, reduced to a handful of small overseas territories. Yet its fingerprints remain clearly visible across the modern world in ways most people rarely notice. English now functions as the closest thing the world has to a genuine global language. Legal systems in India, Australia, Canada, and dozens of other nations still trace directly back to British common law. Railways, universities, and administrative systems built under empire still form the backbone of many countries today. The Commonwealth of Nations, over 50 member states strong, remains a quiet echo of that vanished empire. Border lines drawn hastily by British officials in Africa and the Middle East still shape conflicts happening right now. Cricket, once a purely English pastime, is now a genuine national obsession across India, Pakistan, and the Caribbean. London itself remains a global financial center, partly built on wealth first accumulated through centuries of imperial trade. In 1982, Britain fought a brief war to retake the Falkland Islands, a strange, distant echo of empire. That small victory offered a final flicker of old imperial confidence, though nothing like the world it once ruled. Museums across Britain still display artifacts taken from former colonies, a subject of ongoing international debate today. Descendants of colonized nations now live throughout Britain itself, forever reshaping the culture of the former imperial center. That damp, quarreling little island from the year 1600 became, for a moment, the center of the entire world. And then, faster than almost anyone alive at the time expected, it let that world go again. Historians still argue fiercely over whether the empire's end was a graceful retreat or a forced collapse. What remains certain is that no single battle destroyed it, only decades of accumulated exhaustion and debt. The trading company that began with a few ships in 1600 helped launch a system still running today. Modern multinational corporations still borrow that same basic idea, private power operating with quiet government backing. In many ways, the empire never truly vanished. It simply turned inward, reshaping the nation that built it. Modern debates in Britain over identity, immigration, and its place in the world all trace back to this history. Even the arguments surrounding Brexit echoed old questions about sovereignty, trade, and Britain's role beyond its own shores. The story of Britain is, in the end, a story about how quickly power can rise and fall. A quarter of the world was never really stolen all at once, but claimed instead piece by piece. And it was never really lost all at once either, but released gradually, piece by piece as well. What remains today is a language, a legal tradition, a scattering of institutions, and one enduring warning about power. The empire is gone, but the questions it left behind about power, wealth, and control have never really disappeared.